What happened ye the 1895 Appalachian Mountain Expedition was never meant to be found. Those words were found written in ink so faded it was barely legible, scratched onto the inside cover of a leather-bound journal recovered from a collapsed stone structure deep in the Appalachian wilderness in the autumn of 2019. The journal had been sealed inside a tin box, wrapped in cloth, buried beneath a floor that had not been walked on in over a century. The man who found it was a surveyor named Daniel Holt. He would later say that the moment he opened the tin box, the temperature in the room dropped so sharply he could see his own breath rising in the cold air. He would say that before he even read a single word, something inside him told him to put it back, to seal the box, to walk away and never return to that place. He did not walk away. What he found inside the journal changed the way he understood the world, not because of what it told him about history, or science, or exploration, but because of what it told him about what human beings are capable of when they are completely, utterly alone, deep inside a wilderness that does not want them there, a wilderness that seems, in some ways, to have a memory of its own. This is that story. And before we go any further, take a moment right now and check whether you are already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this one, told with patience and care and a deep respect for the darkness that lives in the margins of history, are what this channel is built for. If you want to keep finding stories that most people have never heard, stories that were buried, hidden, or deliberately forgotten, then subscribing right now is the best decision you will make today. This channel exists for people who are not afraid to look into the shadows. Now, let us go back. Let us go back till the year 1895. Chapter 1. The man who went into the mountains. The Appalachian Mountain range in the autumn of 1895 was not what it is today. There were no paved roads cutting through the valleys. There were no visitor centers with laminated maps and cheerful rangers in brown uniforms. There were no trail markers, no emergency communication systems, no search and rescue teams standing by with helicopters and thermal imaging. There was only the mountain. There was only the forest. There was only the cold, in the dark, in the silence that pressed in from every side like something alive. Into this wilderness, in the early days of October 1895, walked a team of 7 men. Their names were recorded in a brief administrative document filed with the Geographical Survey Office in Washington, Código, a document so unremarkable in its language that it sat unread in an archive for decades. The expedition was officially described as a topographical and geological survey of the interior ridgelines of the southern Appalachian range, with particular attention to mineral deposits, and the charting of unnamed creek systems. It was funded in part by a private investment group based in Philadelphia whose interests, as far as anyone could determine, were commercial in nature. They were looking for coal. They were looking for iron ore. They were looking for anything that could be extracted from the earth and turned into profit. The 7 men who went into the mountains were not famous. They were not the kinds of explorers whose names ended up on monuments or in encyclopedias. They were working men, practical men, men who had done this kind of work before in other wildernesses, in other seasons, under other skies. Their leader was a man named Edmund Calloway, a 43-year-old surveyor from Virginia with more than 2 decades of fieldwork behind him. He was described in the administrative document as experienced and methodical. He was described by people who had worked with him as quiet, precise, and deeply uncomfortable with anything he could not measure or explain. The other 6 men were listed by name in the document: Thomas Rees, a geologist from Pennsylvania; Arthur Fenwick, a cartographer who had done extensive work in the Western Territories; James Morrow, described only as a general laborer; Calvin Pruitt and his younger brother Solomon Pruitt, both from a small mountain community in western North Carolina, who had been hired as local guides; and finally, a man listed in the document only by his initials, Hua, W., whose role was described simply as documentation. It was Hua, W., who kept the journal. We do not know his full name. The detail is one of the many small mysteries that surround the story. In some ways, it is the most unsettling, because the journal he kept is extraordinarily detailed, extraordinarily personal, yet he never once refers to himself by name. He refers to himself only as the writer, or occasionally as the one who records, as if he understood, even before anything had happened, that his role was not to participate in this expedition but to bear witness to it. The journal begins on October the 3rd, 1895. The men had departed from a small town called Ridgecroft at dawn that morning, on foot, carrying their equipment on their backs and onto mules named Patchy and Haiti. The weather was cold and clear. The trees were at the peak of their autumn color, reds and golds and deep burnt oranges stretching away in every direction like something from a painting. Kua W. describes the landscape with a kind of reverent attention, noting the way the morning light fell through the canopy, the sound of the creek they followed north out of town, the smell of wood smoke drifting from the last farmhouse they passed before the trail thinned and then disappeared entirely. He writes, the mountains ahead of us seem tilting slightly inward, as though they are bending down towards a mini US. Kavi says this is the angle of the morning light. Solomon says nothing. He has been looking at the Hidulini since we left town. His expression is one I cannot get you read. The detail about Solomon's expression is one the writer returns to more than once in the early pages of the journal. Solomon Pruitt was the younger of the two brothers, somewhere in his mid-20s, according to Hua W.'s descriptions he was a quiet, physically powerful young man who knew this part of the mountains better than anyone else in the group. He had grown up in these hills. He had hunted in these forests as a boy. He knew the trails, the creek names, the Hidulines, the places where the terrain became deceptive and dangerous. But from the very first day, Solomon Pruitt seemed an easy way that went beyond ordinary caution. On the second day, while the group made camp along a flat shelf of land above a narrow gorge, Hua W. found Solomon sitting apart from the others, staring up at the ridge above them with that same unreadable expression. Hua W. sat down beside him and asked if he was all right. Solomon was quiet for a long time before he answered. Then he said, without taking his eyes off the ridge, there are so many places in these mountains that the old people in my family used to say were not places at all, not cliffs, not valleys, not just land. They called them hollow places, places where something went wrong a long time ago and never went right again. Hua W. asked him what he meant by that. Solomon turned to look at him then, and Hua W. writes that his eyes were very dark and very serious. He said, I mean places where you start to feel like the air is different, like you are being watched, like whatever is watching you has been watching for a very long time and is not surprised to see you come. Hua W. asked if Solomon thought they were heading toward one of those places. Solomon did not answer. He stood up and walked back to the fire. Kaivi, the older Pruitt brother, was different from Solomon in almost every way. He was gregarious, talkative, quick to laugh. He seemed to take a genuine pleasure in the company of the surveyors. He told stories around the fire in the evenings about people in places from his childhood in the mountains, stories that were funny and warm and full of the particular rhythms of mountain speech that Hua W. clearly found charming. He seemed entirely untroubled by any of the concerns that weighed on his younger brother, or so each appeared. On the fourth day, when the expedition had pushed deeper into Dintadyur than any of them had anticipated, crossing two high ridges and descending into a long, narrow valley that Kaivi said he had never entered before, even he grew quieter. The valley was unusual in ways that Hua W. struggles to fully describe. The trees were different there, older and larger than they had been on the slopes above, their bark a darker, mottled gray, their canopies so thick and interlocked overhead that the light that reached the valley floor was dim and greenish, like the light at the bottom of a very deep lake. The creek that ran through the center of the valley was unusually dark, the water moving slowly without sound over a bed of smooth black stones. Edmund Calloway, the expedition leader, noted the geological characteristics of the valley with professional interest. He pointed out to the unusual coloration of the exposed rocky faces on the eastern wall, which showed bands of dark mineral deposits in patterns he had not seen before in this region. He said the valley had likely been carved by glacial action far more ancient than anything they had expected to find this far south. He was, as Hua W. describes him, fully engaged and entirely analytical, moving from rocky face to rocky face with his instruments in his notebook, measuring and recording with the quiet efficiency of a man who sees the world primarily as data to be collected. Thomas Rees, the geologist, was less composed. He examined one of the exposed rocky faces for a long time, then called Calloway over and pointed to something in the stone. Hua W was close enough to hear their conversation, and he recorded each in detail. Reese said he could not explain the formation in front of them. The mineral deposit ran in a pattern that he described as unlike anything in the geological literature, a winding, branching shape that moved through the dark rock in a way that suggested, he said carefully, an organic process rather than an inorganic one, as though something had grown there, something that had been growing for a very, very long time. Calloway told him not to speculate beyond the evidence. Reese said, with a kind of strained calm, I am not speculating. I am describing what I see. That evening, the group made camp at the northern end of the valley, where the ground leveled out into a broad, flat area surrounded by the ancient trees. It was the most sheltered camp they had found since leaving Hidjikacroft, and Calloway expressed satisfaction with the location. The fire was built high, and the men talking. For a little while, the strangeness of the valley seemed to recede. Then, sometime after the fire had burned down, most of the men were in their bedrooms, who heard something. He describes each in the journal with the same careful attention he gives to everything else. Each is this quality of careful attention, this refusal to dramatize or exaggerate, that makes what he writes so deeply unsettling. He writes, I was not asleep. I was lying with my eyes open, looking up at the canopy above me, which was so dacey that I could see no stars, only absolute darkness, when I heard the sound. It was not a sound I recognized. It was not the sound of an animal moving in the undergrowth, which I know well. It was not the sound of the creek, which I could still hear faintly to the south. It was something else, a slow, rhythmic sound, like breathing, but larger than a man's breathing, very close. He lay still and listened. The sound continued for what he estimates was 3 or 4 minutes, steady and unhurried, and then it stopped. He writes, I did not wake the others. I told myself it was the wind moving through the upper branches. I told myself it was some acoustic feature of the valley that made distant sounds seem close. I told myself many things. But in the morning, when I looked at the edge of the camp where the sound had seemed to come from, I found that the ground there was disturbed. Not by footprints, exactly, but by impressions in the moss, large ones, spaced at irregular intervals, as though something very large had been standing there for a long time, shifting its weight. I told no one. Chapter to the house in the valley. On the morning of the 5th day, they found the structure. It was Solomon who saw it first. He stopped walking without warning, so suddenly that James Morrow, who was behind him, walked into him and stumbled. Solomon did not apologize and did not move. He stood completely still, looking through the trees till the right of the trail they had been following. His face had gone the color of old ash. Kua followed his gaze and saw it too. Through the trees, perhaps 40 yards from where they stood, there was a building, or what had once been a building. Each was constructed of rough cut stone, 2 stories in height, with a collapsed roof that had caved inward so that the upper story was open till the sky. The walls were intact, thick and heavy, covered in decades of moss and lichen so dacey that the stone beneath was barely visible. The windows, 3 on the visible face of the structure, were dark and empty, their frames rotted away, the openings irregular and somehow misshapen, as though the stone around them had shifted over the years. There was a door, still in its frame, hanging up at an angle. It was very dark inside. Calloway was immediately interested from a surveyor's perspective. He said the building was clearly not marked on any map of the region, which was itself significant. He estimated from its construction that each dated from sometime in the mid to late 1800s, possibly earlier. He wanted to examine it closely. Solomon said they should not go near it. Calloway asked why. Solomon looked at his older brother. Ikavi looked back at him with an expression describes as complicated, as though some communication passed between them that went beyond words. Then Kavi looked at the ground and said nothing. Solomon said, there is a story in my family about a family that lived in a valley like this one a long time ago. Nobody in the mountains talked about them. Nobody visited them. They were known only by a name that nobody used out loud. My grandmother told me once that the people in that family had done things to themselves, to each other, that went against what it means to be human. She said the valley they lived in remembered what they had done. She said the valley kept it. Calloway said this was folklore and proceeded toward the building. Most of the others followed him. Solomon stayed at the edge of the trees, in Hua. W. stayed near Solomon. In his journal he writes, I am not a superstitious man. I have never been a man who gives weight to stories told around fires, but something about the way Solomon said those words made it impossible for me to move toward that building. There was a certainty in his voice that was not the certainty of superstition. It was the certainty of a man who knows something that he cannot fully explain. He knows it in his bones. What Calloway and the others found inside the building would occupy the next several entries in the journal, in what W. records of their accounts, combined with his own eventual, reluctant entry into the structure on the following day, constitutes the most disturbing portion of the entire document. The ground floor of the building was a single large room. There was a stone fireplace on the fat wall, its heart filled with years of fallen debris from the collapsed roof above. There were the remains of furniture, so rotted as to be almost unrecognizable, though Calloway identified what appeared to be the remnants of a large table and several chairs. There were shelves on the walls, still attached, still holding objects, vessels of some kind, ceramic or stone, some intact and some broken, tools whose purpose was not immediately clear. There were marks on the walls, not words, not images in any recognizable sense, but marks, deep ones, carved into this stone itself with something sharp, running in these irregular patterns across every visible surface. They were not decorative, or at least not decorative in any way that any of the men could identify. Rees, examining them closely, said they appeared to be measurement markings of some kind, as though someone had been recording something over a very long period of time. He counted layers of marks, new ones catch over old ones. He estimated that the recording process had continued for decades, perhaps longer. Fenwick, the cartographer, found a wooden box beneath the debris near the fireplace. Inside the box, protected by its wooden casing from the worst of the moisture and decay, were papers, handwritten documents in a cramped, irregular script. He brought them to Calloway, and the two men spent a long time attempting to read them. The language was English, but the handwriting was difficult, and many of the words were unfamiliar, or used in ways that did not correspond to ordinary usage. What they were able to decipher, according to W.'s account of what they told him, was this: the documents appeared to be a record of a family that had lived in that valley, a family that had, over the course of several generations, cut themselves off entirely from the outside world, from any contact with other people, from many of the ordinary human networks of community in support that most people take for granted. The reasons for this isolation were not entirely clear from the fragments they could read. There was something in the documents about a fear of the outside world, something about a belief that the valley was the only safe place, something about decisions that had been made within the family to keep the family contained, to keep it whole, to keep it, in some terrible sense of the word, pure. The physical consequences of this isolation, sustained over multiple generations, were recorded in the documents with a clinical detachment that Calloway found deeply troubling. He was not a man who was easily troubled, but what was described in those pages, the progressive changes that had appeared in the members of the family over time, the ways in which their bodies had begun to show the evidence of what they had done to themselves, not through violence but through the slow accumulation of consequence, that comes from closing a living system in on itself and sealing it from the outside. These things affected them in a way that W. describes as visible. He says Calloway's hands were not kept steady when he set the papers down. He said, whatever lived it was not a family, not any longer, not in any meaningful sense. W. does not record what specifically was written in those documents about the physical appearance of the people described. He says only that the descriptions were deeply wrong, and that their ignorance was of a kind that went beyond injury or illness. He says the words used in the documents, even the strange and difficult ones, conveyed a sense of alteration, of a human form that had continued to live and breathe and move through the world but had, in some ways that were visible and some that were not, become something else, not through any supernatural process, but through the slow, patient, relentless logic of isolation and its consequences. That night, back in the camp, the mood among the men was very different from what it had been the night before. There was little conversation. The fire burned high and nobody suggested letting it burn lower. James Morrow, who had barely spoken since the first day of the expedition, drank from a flask for most of the evening and stared into the flames. Fenwick worked on his maps with a kind of forced concentration that seemed to like an attempt to anchor himself in something practical and measurable. Reese sat apart from the others, as Solomon had done on the first night, and stared at the dark wall of trees surrounding the camp. Kevin Pruitt, who had been the most talkative member of the group since the start of the expedition, told no stories that evening. He sat close to his younger brother. He spoke to him in a very low voice. Ihua, sitting nearby, could not make out the words, only the tone, which was urgent and quiet, and had a quality that he describes as pleading. He writes, I do not know what Kevin was saying to Solomon, but I know that Solomon shook his head several times. Once he put his hand on his brother's arm, a gesture that seemed intended to comfort him, as though Solomon was the older of the two, and not the younger. Later that night, Hua heard the sound again. This time it was different. He writes, it began the same way, that slow, deep, rhythmic sound from the darkness at the edge of the camp. But this time it did not remain constant. It changed. It became irregular. And then, for a few seconds that I will not forget for the rest of my life, it sounded like something else entirely. Not breathing, not wind, something that was almost a voice, something that was organized in a way that suggested an attempt to produce language, though whether successfully, I cannot say, because the moment I understood what I might be hearing, I squeezed my eyes shut and lay absolutely still and did not move for a very long time. In the morning, he found that Solomon Pruitt's bedroom was empty. Solomon had not been seen in the night. Kevin was awake before anyone else and standing at the edge of the camp, looking into the trees, calling his brother's name in a low, controlled voice that did not conceal the fear beneath it. Calloway organized an immediate search of the surrounding area. The men spread out in pairs. He called Solomon's name. He moved through the undergrowth in the gray morning light. He found nothing, no trace of him, no footprints, no sign of which direction he might have gone. They searched for most of the morning. They did not find Solomon Pruitt. What they found, instead, at the base of a large rocky outcrop approximately 200 yards east of the camp, was a piece of cloth. Heavy wool, dark green, the kind of fabric that Solomon's coat was made from. It was snagged on a sharp edge of the rock, at a height of roughly 6 feet from the ground, as though someone or something passing that point very quickly had caught it there. A single piece of cloth at 6 feet, no footprints below it, nothing else. Calloway said they would continue searching. He said there was a rational explanation. He said Solomon had likely woken in the night, walked away from camp for some private reason, he became disoriented in the darkness. He said they would find him. The look on Kevin's face suggested that he did not entirely believe this. Hua writes, I stood looking at that piece of cloth on the rock for a long time after the others moved on. I looked at the height of it and I thought about the sound I had heard in the night, the way it had changed, the way it had almost been a voice. I thought about what Solomon had said on the first evening about the hollow places in these mountains, about places where something went wrong a long time ago and never went right again, about being watched by something that had been watching for a very long time. And then I thought, we have been in this valley for 2 days. We have not yet been inside the building, not all of us, not at night. Chapter 3 What lived inside the walls that afternoon. Calloway made a decision that divided the group. He said they would spend one muddy night in the valley. He said they would use the remaining daylight to conduct a thorough search for Solomon and to complete the geological survey of the rock formations near the building. He said the survey was their professional obligation and that abandoning it without adequate reason was not something he was willing to do. He said the disappearance of Solomon Pruitt was deeply concerning but was not, in his assessment, evidence of anything other than a man who had wandered away from camp in the night. He said accidents happened in wilderness surveys. He said they would find Solomon or they would report his disappearance to the appropriate authorities upon their return to Hidjikekroch. Morrow said he was leaving. Calloway told him he could not leave alone. Morrow said he would take one of the mules. He was going south and anyone who wanted to come with him was welcome to do so. Anyone who wanted to stay was welcome to do so. He did not especially care which. Fenwick said he agreed with Morrow. Rees was silent for a moment. Then he said, I want to go back to that building first. I want to look at it again in daylight. Something I saw yesterday. I need to understand it. Calloway looked at him. Rees said, there were muddy markings. Not on the walls. On the floor, in one of the corners. I only saw them for a moment. I need to look at them again. Hua W. writes, I do not know why I said what I said next. I did not plan to say it. But I looked at Kaivi, who had been standing apart from all of us during this conversation. I said, Kaivi, what do you know about this place? Not what Solomon told us. What do you know? Calvin looked at me for a long time. He looked at the ground. He looked at the building, visible through the trees from where we stood. Then he said something that Hua W. records verbatim, in full, the longest single passage of direct speech in the entire journal. Kaivi said, our family has lived in these mountains for a long time. My great-grandmother, she used to talk about the people who had lived in this valley. She didn't like to talk about it. She said they came it sometime in the early part of the century before last, a whole group of them. They wanted nothing to do with anyone outside their family. She said they believed the outside world was a kind of poison, that contact with outsiders was a kind of corruption. So they stayed it. When the older ones died, the younger ones grew up. They stayed it too. The ones they had children with, they were the people they knew, because there was nobody else. She said when she was a young girl, her father saw one of them once, at a distance, near the edge of the valley. He said each was walking upright but that each moved wrong, like something that had learned to walk by watching from a distance rather than by learning in the normal way. He said its face was not like a face he knew. He said each turned and looked at me, then each went back into the trees. He walked home very fast and he never came back to this valley, and he told his children never to come yet. Kaivi stopped speaking. He looked at Hua W. He said, Solomon knew all of this. He knew it better than I did. He came it anyway because we needed the money. He thought whatever had lived it was long gone. He thought the valley was empty. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Reese said, quietly, I do not think the valley is empty. They went to the building that afternoon. All of them, in the end, even Morrow, though he stayed close to the door the entire time, he never went more than a few steps inside. The afternoon light was flashing gray, the sky having clouded over since morning. What light came through the empty windows in the collapsed roof was pale and cold and made the interior of the building feel even more removed from the ordinary world than it had the day before. Reese went straight to the corner he had mentioned. He crouched down and cleared away a layer of debris with his hands, leaving small pieces of fallen stone in the dark, crumbling material that was all that remained of whatever organic matter had been there originally. Beneath the debris carved into the stone floor itself were markings that were different from the ones on the walls. These were not the days, irregular recording marks that covered the walls. These were deliberate, shaped. They formed a pattern that was recognizable as figurative, or nearly so. They showed a style that was rough but not without skill, a series of human forms, standing figures, arranged in a rough circle. At the center of the circle, something that was not clearly a human form, something larger, something that the carver had rendered with a kind of virgin imprecision, as though they had been trying to depict something that was very difficult to depict accurately, something that changed or that could not be fully seen. Reese said nothing for a long time. Then he said, someone was afraid of something, and they carved each edit to remember what they were afraid of, or possibly to contain each. The word he used was contain. Hua W. writes, I looked at the carving for a long time. I thought about the sound I had heard for 2 nights running at the edge of the camp. I thought about Solomon's empty bedroll. I thought about the piece of cloth on the hook at 6 feet from the ground. I thought about what Kaivi had said, about movement that was wrong, about a face that was not like a face he knew. Standing there in the cold, dim room, surrounded by the marks of people who had lived in isolation for so long that they had become something else, something that had not stopped living in this valley simply because the last of them had ceased to breathe. I understood something. I understood why the journal I was writing would one day need to be sealed in a tin box and buried under the floor. Not to protect the journal, to protect whoever might eventually find each from understanding too quickly what each contained. Some knowledge is better arrived at slowly, in stages. With time to prepare. That night was the worst night. Calloway had insisted they stay. He had insisted with a firmness that seemed, till Hua W. like a man overriding his own instincts through sheer force of professional pride. The camp was quiet. The fire was large. The men kept their distance from the edges of the light, staying close till the sentir, and nobody slept or even tried to sleep. Sometime after what Hua W estimates was midnight, something came till the edge of the camp, not invisibly destime, not as a sound or a disturbance in the moss. Something came and stood at the very edge of the fiery light, where the light began to fail and the darkness began. Each stood there for a long time, each was visible, not fully, not in a way that a person standing clearly in full light is visible, but visible enough, an outline, a shape, tall, much taller than any of the men, in proportion in ways that Hua W refuses to describe being detailed, saying only that the proportions were not those of an ordinary human body, that they suggested alterations which had accumulated over a long time in a closed system which had produced a result that the human eye recognized as related to humanity without fully accepting as human. Each stood there at the edge of the light. Each was looking at them, not moving, not making the breathing sound, just standing and looking, with what Hua W describes as a patience that was almost geologically its quality, a patience that belonged to something that had been it long before any of them arrived and would be it long after all of them were gone. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. After a time that Hua W estimates as between 10 and 20 minutes, though he acknowledges that his sense of time in that moment was unreliable, the shape turned and moved back into the darkness, and then each was gone. Calloway said, in the silence after each left, that they would break camp at first light. Nobody disagreed. If you have stayed with this story till this point, then you already know what kind of person you are. You are the kind of person who needs to know what happened, who cannot walk away from a story like this one until it reaches its end. That is exactly the kind of person this channel is built for. So before we go any further, if you are not yet subscribed, do it now. This channel will keep bringing you stories like this one, stories that were buried and forgotten, stories that the light of ordinary history never reached. Subscribe. You will not regret each chapter for what they left behind. In what followed, they broke camp before dawn. The fire was still burning when they left, and none of them turned back to look at each. The mules were loaded with as much of the equipment as could be managed quickly, and what could not be loaded was left. Fenwick left his transit and most of his survey stakes. Reeves left hockey samples he had spent 3 days collecting. Morrow left the majority of the cooking equipment. None of each seemed important. None of each seemed worth the extra time. Kaivi moved out to the front of the group, following the same route they had taken north into the valley, moving with a purpose, a speed that communicated itself to everyone around and increased their own pace without anyone needing to say a word. He did not look back. He moved like a man who has decided that looking back is a luxury he cannot afford. Hua W walked near the back of the group. He looked back. He did not see anything following them. The valley, in the pre-dawn darkness, was utterly still. The ancient trees stood motionless on either side of the trail. The dark creek moved in silence over its black stones. The building was visible, briefly, through a gap in the trees, its stone walls pale in the darkness, its broken windows like closed eyes. And then the trail curved and the building disappeared behind the trees, and Hua W faced forward and walked. They crossed the first ridge as the sky began to lighten in the east. The trees changed as they climbed, became smaller and younger, the enormous dark canopy of the valley replaced by the ordinary mixed forest of the higher slopes. The air changed too, lighter and cleaner, and carrying the smell of autumn leaves and distant wood smoke that was the smell of the inhabited world. And as the sky brightened, the world became recognizable again. Hua W writes that some of the terrible weight of the valley began to lift from the group. And men who had been walking in rigid, forward-facing silence began to breathe more easily and occasionally to speak. But Kaivi did not ease. He maintained his pace until they were well down the southern slope of the first ridge, until the valley was behind the full ridges of mountain terrain, several miles of rough trail. Only then did he stop. He stopped at a wide bend in the creek that had guided them south, a place with a flat, open bank on the western side where the morning light fell clearly. The view was long in every direction. He stopped. He put his hands on his knees. He breathed for a moment. Then he stood up straight. He looked at the men around him. He said, "Solomon is not coming back." He said it in the same way that someone states a fact about the weather, not without feeling, but with the kind of flat, clear-eyed acceptance that comes after the feeling has already done most of its work. In the night, in the silences, in all the moments nobody was watching. He said each and then he was quiet, and the other men were quiet with him. They fought a little while the only sound was the creaking the wind and somewhere above them the distant call of a bird. Then Calloway said, I am going to write in my official report that Solomon Pruitt became separated from the group during the surveying, that a thorough search was conducted but he could not be located. I am going to recommend that a search party be organized by the county sheriff to look for him. I am going to say nothing in the report about the building, or about the documents we found inside, or about anything we observed on the final night. He looked at each of the men in turn as he said this. One by one, each of them nodded. Kua W. writes, I nodded too. I meant each, the moment. I told myself that what we had seen could not be accurately described in any official document. I told myself that a report containing what we had actually experienced would not be believed and would not help Solomon. It would only bring Maori people into that valley. But even as I told myself these things, I knew that there was another reason I agreed to stay silent. I agreed because I was afraid, not of being disbelieved, of being believed, of saying the words out loud in daylight and having them become fully real. The group reached Appalachia on the afternoon of the following day. They were met with the ordinary small-town curiosity of a community that had watched 7 men walk out of town so many days before and was now watching 6 of them walk back. Calloway spoke to the sheriff that same evening. A search party was organized within 48 hours. Calvi participated in that search. In Hua W. records that he watched Calvi hide out of town with the sheriff's men with an expression that contained, alongside the grief, a knowledge that could not be spoken. The search party found nothing. No trace of Solomon Pruitt. No sign of the building in the valley. They reported that the interior of the range was densely forested, a difficult terrain, and that extended searches would require significant resources that were not available. The case was recorded as a missing person, cause unknown, presumed accident. The file was closed. Edmund Calloway filed his topographical report with the Geographical Survey Office. Each contained detailed maps of the ridge lines north of Ridgecroft and thorough geological data for the upper slopes. Each contained no reference to the valley and no mention of the structure discovered within each. Each is, as Hua W. writes, a document that was perfectly accurate in everything each contained, a completely dishonest in everything each left out. Hua W. returned to wherever he had come from. We do not know where that was. We do not know what happened till the months and years after the expedition. We do not know his full name. We know only that at some point, he wrote up a complete account of everything he had experienced in that valley, the account that would become the journal found by Daniel Holt more than a century later. We know that he sealed it in a tin box and wrapped it in a cloth and returned to the valley, alone, and buried it under the floor of that building. We know this because he says so, in the final pages of the journal. He writes, I am returning this record to the place it belongs, not because I want it to remain hidden forever, but because I believe that so many things should only be found when the time is right, when the person who finds it is ready to understand what it means. I do not know when that will be. I do not know who that person will be. But I know this, they will feel, the moment they open this box, a drop in temperature. They will feel something telling them to walk away, and they will stay anyway. Because the kind of person who finds something like this is the kind of person who cannot walk away from what they need to know. If that is you, then I am glad it is you. Be careful in this valley. Leave before dark. And do not make the mistake of assuming that because you have read these words, you now understand what lives it. Understanding requires proximity. In proximity, in this place, has a cost. He signed it only with his initials. Kua W. Daniel Holt, the surveyor who found the journal in 2019, did not stay in the valley after dark. He has said in interviews that he read the final pages of the journal inside the building, in the afternoon, and that by the time he finished reading, the temperature in the room had dropped considerably and the light coming through the empty windows had taken on the particular gray-green quality that Hua W. had described in the valley during the expedition. He said he packed up the tin box in the journal. He walked out of the valley as quickly as he could manage without running. He said he did not run because he felt, very strongly, that running was not something he should do, that running was the kind of movement that attracted attention. He has never gone back. The journal was authenticated by 3 separate document analysis firms, all of whom confirmed that the paper, ink, e-writing materials were consistent with Latin 19th century production. The documents found inside the building, or the fragments that remained of them, were also examined by historians, who confirmed that the handwriting, language were consistent with the period described. The geological survey filed by Edmund Calloway was found in the National Archives, exactly as Rua W. described it, accurate e its contents in silent on the valley. There is no record of what became of the Pruitt family after October 1895. There is no record of Calvin Pruitt after that year. There is a single entry in a county death register from 1900, listing a Calvin Pruitt, not the alternate spelling, cause of death listed as unknown, location listed as the mountains. No further details. The building is still there. Holt has not provided its exact coordinates to anyone. He has said that he thinks Rua W. was right, that some things should be found only by the right person at the right time, that making it easily accessible would not serve anyone well. He has also said, in a brief interview given several months after the discovery, that since returning from the valley he occasionally hears, very late at night when the house is quiet, a slow rhythmic sound that seems still coming from just outside wherever he is, that it lasts for a few minutes and then stops, that it has never gotten closer, that it sounds, he says, like breathing. Now, if you have watched this far, if you have stayed through every chapter of this story, through the cold in the darkness in this slow terrible revelation of what lived in that valley, then I want you to do something right now. Leave a comment below this video and write, I stayed until the end. 3 words. That is all, because I want to know who you are. I want to know who the people are who can sit with a story like this one all the way to its end and not look away. You are the people this channel exists for, and I want to see you. If the story reached into you the way a story like this one is supposed to, if it made you feel the cold, if it made you listen a little harder to the sounds outside your window tonight, then give it a like before you go. Not for the algorithm, though the algorithm appreciates it, but because liking this video is how you tell me that what we did it together tonight, this slow journey into the dark, was worth making. It is how you say, keep going, keep finding these stories, keep bringing them till the light, and shed it. Send it to someone who will not be able to sleep after watching it. Send it to someone who needs to know that the wilderness has a memory. Send it to someone who is not afraid of the dark. As for you, make sure you are subscribed, because there are more stories like this one waiting to be told. Stories that were buried. Stories that were sealed in tin boxes and wrapped in real cloth and left under the floors of buildings and valleys that do not appear on any map. Stories that were never meant to be found. Until now. Until you. Stay curious. Stay careful. And do not forget to leave before dark.